to everyone who's joined our resource management capability webinar. We will be sharing the recording post the session, so don't stress about feverishly taking notes or screenshots of the presentation. We'll share both the presentation and the recording after the session. I will introduce our speaker, who is Jelley, CEO of Project Portfolio Office. He is going to be sharing some of the lessons he's learned on his implementation journey, implementing resource management across both our PPO client base as well as other clients that are not PPO users but have gone on this journey. So over to you, Guy.
Good stuff. Thanks, Taryn, and thanks everybody for joining today. There are still a lot of people in the lobby, so I'm going to start in the meantime, and Taryn, I suppose, will manage them. If there's any questions, you're more than welcome to pop it into the chat during the session. I'm going to try and finish up at about 22 to give us more than enough time for questions at the end. But if there are something that springs to mind or whatever, put in the chat. The ladies will answer it if they can. Otherwise, Taryn will point me to it at the end. So for those of you I've never met, as Taryn said, my name is Jelley, and what I want to cover today is resource management. And it's a bit of an art and a science, unfortunately, and it's one of those rather tough areas, I think, to get right and to get your capability in place around this. This is a series of webinars we do, and I'll cover it at the very end, but we do PPO product webinars, about 3 to 4 a year. We run the PMO forum for those of you that are involved with that. So that's a forum for PMO leaders and exec. And this webinar fits into the PPM space. So it's project portfolio management. It deals with capabilities within this space. You do not have to be a PPO client, so the technology client. I know some of you I recognize on the call are PPO clients, and thanks for coming and joining us. Some of you are not, which is also awesome. So we do these webinars just to provide some context and some giving back into the PPM community. So these are common PPM problems, and whether you from a technology point of view, whether you have Excel or whether you have PPO or whether you have one of our competitor products, I think the principles don't change too much. What I'm going to share with you today, some of these I've done with PPO, the technology set, and some of them I've done on Excel with clients. So it's not something that you need to be a PPO client, but obviously thanks to all the PPO clients and users that have joined us today. I'm going to run through this presentation. I always like to start with something like this. So, I mean, I think generally what we're experiencing in the last couple of years is a feverish attempt to try and do more with less, whether that's business agility or whether that's corporate targets that are, pushed down or whatever these things are. But I mean, we're seeing a increasing demand for project delivery to happen faster, more projects with less. And this resource management is obviously something that plays a key role. Just to get a dipstick before we get into the presentation, we generally find 5 types of organizations. Ones that are doing resource capacity planning and are doing it well, some that are doing it but have challenges, others that are starting the journey, some that haven't started anything yet but need to or planning to, and others that are not doing it and at this time have no need to or no plan to start. So I think Taryn's going to quickly pop up a poll quickly. It's got those 5 options. Just give us an A, B, C, or D, or E. I think the poll will pop up on the side. It's one of these integrated teams polls, I think. And just give us a quick oversight as to where you fit into one of those 5 categories. It'll just give me some insight into how much of the audience is an A or a B or a C or a D or an E. And I'll cover some of that when I get to the questions section at the end. If anyone's battling with a poll, you'll have to just ask Taryn. I see there are some comments coming in. Tegan, yeah, I know you guys are definitely on the journey. So yeah, I think B is a good touch point for where you are. I'm going to give a second or two and then I'm going to jump straight into this. I think the poll, Taryn, people can continue to do while I move on, I believe.
Yes, Taryn. That's right, Guy.
Terence says yes. Okay, so let me start. I think let me just start. I mean, resource management is quite a broad topic, and I'm going to talk about two sides of it today. What I refer to as resource capacity planning, and then resource utilization. A lot of clients come to us and they say they've got a resource utilization problem, but they actually refer more to some of the capacity planning. So resource capacity planning, for what I'm going to cover today, is the practice and the disciplines of identifying, allocating, and resourcing the required resources on a project. So it's your supply and demand, and it's the planning side. It's the upfront side. It's, how do we plan to spend our resources and where do we need to be playing it? Resource utilization for me is the practice of recording the after effect, the actual time spent on the activity. So that's where our resources utilized on the projects that we planned. What is the resource utilization rates? So the capacity planning is the before side of it, and the utilization is the after side of it. If you've got both, great, you've got the before and the after picture, and you should be able to do some comparisons around, what were we planning and how accurate was our planning based on what was actually spent. But a lot of organizations are more just interested in the capacity planning side and are not too focused on the utilization. And you don't have to do both, but I just wanted to cover the terminology around capacity planning for me versus the utilization. So I will touch on both of them, but you don't have to be doing both. I think just some case studies quickly, because a lot of clients, when I do work with them in this space, when I share some of the previous lessons and some of the stuff and why organizations came to us, they then start to say, okay, but those are also things that we experienced or problems that we had. I did this work about 3 years ago with a company in the UK. They've got global offices, so they implement across the world, and they've got an e-commerce solution that they implement. And the reason, or what they were achieving, or the outcomes of the work that was done, was a greater transparency on the costs associated with projects. So whether you're an internal PMO and you're servicing the business, and whether you do recover your PMO costs or not, or whether that's a shared cost that goes to the business, or if you're an organization that delivers external projects to external people and you may charge a fee for that or not, I think one of the outcomes of doing this is an improved understanding of not just the capacity in terms of hours and utilization, but the potential cost that goes with that. For organizations that do projects for people, whether that's internal or external, understanding the profitability of the project and the customer that you're doing the project for is one of the outcomes that these guys got. So, there were a lot of times where projects were done for organizations or for some of their clients, but the profitability of all their projects was very different based on what was sold and what was planned and what was ultimately implemented. Because they do external projects, they had a funnel or a forecast of projects that were coming up that their sales team were busy working on. So doing this exercise gave them the ability to see their future resource demand. So not just what's currently happening, but if this pipeline of projects was to materialize, this is what our future resource demand would be. And then the other thing, and I think it experienced it a lot specifically with IT projects, is even though the project may come to an end, there's this ongoing time or cost or effort that's still required on some of these systems or some of these projects. So the understanding of that cost to service the client was something that they got out of it. Another example that I worked on was a bottling company, also once again a worldwide implementation. And the key thing here was this was internal projects done for the business by the PMO. But the benefits or the outcomes that came out here, and I'll speak a lot about these in terms of my recommendation of how you go about doing this, was understanding the capacity of the critical skills and a lot of work on prioritization, optimizing the resource availability, and there a lot of work on activation. And when I say activation, it's starting these projects, or when do they start. Improvements in planning and prioritizing, so a lot of sequencing. It's very common that I see for clients to get a list of projects they're going to do for the year, get the necessary funding and approval, and then on the 1st of January try and kick off every single project all at the same time and hit a massive bottleneck. So the sequencing of that, and then reprioritization constantly based on the over and under allocation. So unfortunately, as I mentioned up front, this is quite often an art and a science. So you need to keep these things in balance on an ongoing basis. IT projects in a financial services space. The outcomes here, and I think one of the benefits here, and something that's a byproduct of doing this that I'm going to talk you guys through today, is a communication tool, a mechanism to create a narrative around where some of the challenges are, where some of the bottlenecks are, and what we as an organization need to do, whether that's sourcing more resourcing, better sequencing, introducing prioritization, getting more headcount, whatever the outcome to solve the problems are. But what this organization found was, over and above implementing it, was a communication mechanism where they could start to talk about prioritization, where they could start to talk about the impacts of this and the cost of the PMO and how it should be recovered, and paying your fair share and those type of things. So there's a lot of these additional benefits and lessons that we've learned in doing this, which I'm going to cover as we go forward. Other things that I think I've started seeing more recently, which I just want to put out, is things like capitalization. A lot of organizations are wanting to capitalize the cost of their internal resources on projects. So presenting business cases for approval or getting the necessary funding has a significant impact in terms of understanding what the actual internal cost is. So if you are in the mode of capitalizing your costs and you need to understand what those internal costs would be before you approve the projects, or if you're doing some sort of cost recovery, like you're sharing the cost of the PMO or you're using a pay-as-you-go model, understanding the resource capacity and the utilization of those resources is key. A lot of organizations these days have a resource flexing or an outsourced partner model where they bring resources in from contracting houses or from organizations that they partnered with based on the demand. So getting your resource capacity planning in place and doing it well helps a hell of a lot if you're flexing resources and if you've got these outsourced models. So these are some of the case studies, and what I'm going to do is take you through my recommendations around 6 steps, which I would be doing if I was in your organizations today and tasked with sorting out resource capacity management. So I'm going to take you through each step. I'm going to explain to you what each step means. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And then at the end, I will explain to you some of the things that you will see or some of the things that are going to pop up in doing this. This is my recommendation. It's based on work that we've done in the past. It's also changed, funnily enough. The steps have changed as we've done more and more of it, and the actual sequence of the steps has actually changed as we've done more and more of it. You'll obviously have to align it fit for purpose for your organization, and more importantly, trying to position it for where you are in the process. Are you already doing it with some gaps, or you're about to start? That will definitely impact on the steps that you follow. But I just wanted to give a broad overview of the 6 steps, and I'm going to talk through each one in detail. Okay, so let's get straight in. This might sound very weird, but it happens all the time, and I think it's human nature as well, is you need to understand why you want to do resource capacity planning before you do it. A lot of organizations come to us and say, we need to improve our resource management, and then I start asking them, but why? And it's because they think it's something they have to do. They heard that resource management is one of the disciplines that PMOs do. They bought a piece of software and resource management is one of the features or functionality or modules, and they want to use it. So there's no actual reason for doing it, just in the fact that somebody thinks they need to do it, or the theory says I have to do it, or it's one of the core capabilities that my PMO should be doing, or I attended Guy's webinar and therefore I think I need to do it. So before you get going, I think you need to understand exactly why you're doing it, because there's reasons why you should be doing it, and it's difficult to do. To get it right, to get it working, to add long-term to value is tough. So don't just jump into it because you think it's something nice to tackle. Most of you work in a fairly big PMO, if I look at the names that are here, and you're constantly managing this thing between delivery and capability or maturity. So, we have to deliver, and our projects are important, and we need to deliver them on time and efficiently and effectively. But at the same time, we have to keep building that internal capability or maturity so that we can continue to deliver even faster and even more going forward. And you have to balance these two. You can't spend all the time building capability and maturity and not delivering, but you also can't just deliver all day and never worry about the long-term capability that you build in as an organization or as a PMO. So PMO managers are constantly, stuck with trying to balance these two. And a lot of why you would go and do resource capacity planning would be to, try and improve on the capability, but also on the delivery. So If you're not sure whether it's something you should be doing or it's something that you're thinking about but not sure, I mean, these are some of the signs that I think you should be doing resource capacity planning. Projects are often delayed due to resource availability. So we see it a lot, we hear it a lot. If you're using PPO as a technology, a lot of our clients have regular reporting in place, whether that's weekly or monthly, and they've got their health indicators that they go and update. And when your portfolio starts reporting 40, 50, 60% of your projects are delayed, and if you look at your resource health indicator and that's always amber and red, you're starting to see a common thread that says our projects are constantly delayed, and the underlying reason is resource availability. Maybe resources aren't available at the right time, maybe they're too stretched, maybe they plan to be working but they're doing other stuff. And if that starts to become a common theme, it's probably time for you to start looking at resource capacity planning if you're not doing it. And if you are doing it, try and understand why those things are happening. A lot of time I see in status reporting and portfolio reporting that resources are getting shuffled and moved around, irrespective of project priorities, or in most cases, there aren't even project priorities, but, resources that were working on a project are now pulled to another project or to another initiative. And if that's constantly happening, where resources are being moved between projects, not based on some formal process or priority, that's a sign that resource capacity planning is probably something that you require. A lot of us see this a lot, working long hours on an ongoing basis. It's that dichotomy of managing the delivery, but the capability. I mean, you can't continue to deliver projects and work significantly long hours, day in, day out, week in, week out. It's just not a sustainable model to build capability. The other side is that you constantly seem to have resources that are available. So while you have a couple of people who are always heavily stretched and over allocated, there seems to be other pockets in the business where there's lots of capacity or lots of resource availability. And that also is a problem that could potentially be addressed if proper resource capacity capability was in place. Firefighting, you'll get through a couple of projects, you'll be able to deliver one or two strategic initiatives by firefighting, but it's not a capability or a mode that you want your business or your PMO to be in forever. So if you're getting stuff done, but you constantly feel like it's firefighting, that could be one of the symptoms of you needing improved resource capacity planning. I see this all the time. It freaks me out. I don't understand it, but a lot of clients will have projects that are in flight, they're running, execution, sprints are happening, but they're still trying to recruit the necessary resources. They're still trying to steal resources from other projects. They're still trying to convince business to give them dedicated SMEs. So, I mean, if your projects are in flight and they're active and they're, working and stuff is happening, but you're still trying to recruit the necessary resources, that for me is a clear sign that some of the resource capacity planning principles and processes may not be in place. Contract resources, I mean, if you don't have a good line of sight of, who you need when you need it, and then, if you have zero resource visibility. I've often sat in project review committees or exco sessions with a PMO that I might be helping or coaching, and projects are approved, and I walk out and I say to the PMO manager, do we have enough capacity to deliver all of that? And they'll turn around to me and say, I've got no idea. And I'll say, but how do we approve projects or how do we activate projects if we don't have that visibility? So any one of these 8 signs or a combination of them are probably indications that you need to be looking at resource capacity planning. But if you don't recognize these or some of these are not happening, then I'd really stop and think and say, be sure that you want to start this journey because you need to understand why you're addressing it. So those 8 and others will give you a good understanding of what's a pain or what's a problem or what's holding you back and why you need to start the journey. If you've got some resource capacity planning, but you're now talking about the utilization side, then these are some of the ones, and I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. So do you need to better understand of the productivity of your project resources? Is there a general consensus that we're not productive enough or we're not being used in the right spaces? Is there a lack of understanding of how long certain things take? What I commonly find, and I'll talk about it as well during the presentation, is our resource capacity planning, one of the big problems we have is we're not sure of how long things take. We constantly underestimate. This requirement is going to take us a week. This piece of analysis is going to take us 2 weeks, and it ends up taking a month, or these type of things. So if we're not really sure of how long these things take, that's typically a reason to be looking at resource utilization. Which activities consume the most amount of time? If you're not sure going through projects, which of your initial activities are going to be consuming your time, then understanding the utilization, the time spent side becomes important. If you're charging for your projects, whether that's internal charging or whether that's external, getting discrepancies, getting customers coming back to say they're not sure why this has been charged or why so much time was spent on this project is a problem. And then lastly, a lot of project managers are managing the costs of their projects, and the biggest cost component of their projects is the resource cost. So if you don't have line of sight of what that resource cost is, or you're getting it so late in the process that you can't manage your project budget, those are signs that you probably need to be looking at the resource utilization. But I think the key thing before you start and before you go anywhere is making sure that you understand, is it resource capacity planning that you're looking at? Is it utilization that you're looking at? Or is it an element of both? And once you've really asked yourself those questions and drilled into some of the symptoms, you're probably in a good position to start. So don't just jump into it because the theory says you need it, or because you put it on your roadmap, or because you think you're going to improve your maturity by a point by doing it. You need to have those symptoms, you need to see those pains, you need to experience some of those things. Step number 2 is probably the first hurdle or the first stumbling block that most organizations get to, and that's defining what I call work types. So my strong recommendation is, if you're interested in resource capacity planning and utilization, after you know why you're doing it, go off and define work types. Resources in most cases are not dedicated to projects. It's very rare in our client space that we have resources dedicated to projects. They do other stuff besides projects. And then when they work on projects, they're typically working on 2, 3, 4, 5 projects in some cases, which make doing this much more complex. So what I recommend, and what we've done with clients in the past, is to say, let's just bucket work in various high-level types. And in all the exercises we've done, we typically end up in most cases with 3 buckets: project work, operational or BAU work, and overhead work. And overhead work, we throw in things like leave and training and internal management and human resources, or any of those type of things. The biggest mistake most clients make when they try and start this resource capacity planning is to try and go down to a very low level. And the strong recommendation I can give you is, as you start this journey, start on the highest level. Just try and understand what's project work, what's BAU work, and what's generally overhead work. Once you get this process working, you can always drop future levels down and you can get to more detail. But if you start with too much detail, it makes it very painful to get this working and to keep your data updated and to get your forums in place and those things. So I strongly recommend start with 3 buckets: project work, operational or BAU work, and overhead work. It's quite difficult to understand all the different work pieces and how they fit into the buckets. If you do timesheets, or if you have timesheets, good or bad, Excel or some fancy system, doesn't matter. It's a nice way to go and look at where resources have spent their time in the last 3 months or 6 months, and you can quite easily bucket those pieces of work into those 3 buckets: project work, operational work, and overhead work. But don't try and define it down to the lowest level. I think I've seen organizations do it, and you end up causing such a complexity on step number 2 that you never get there. The second biggest mistake that organizations make is trying to manage all resources. So if you're going to start this journey, or if you're starting this journey, identify what I call your golden resources. Identify which people, which skills, which roles, which bottlenecks you have that generally cause a pain when it comes to project delivery. It's not everybody. If you're in the IT space, it's system architects, it's system analysts, it might be a couple of key SMEs, those type of people, but don't try and do this across your entire resource pool, especially if you're starting. If project management the project managers are your capacity constraint, focus there. If some of your key business people and project managers are your constraints or your pains, start there. You will inherently know, in a brief conversation with your project managers, you'll quickly come up with either named individuals who are your golden resources or specific sort of job families or roles that are your key resources. But be very clear that you don't need to try and manage every single resource. I've got a customer who manages the time of their sponsors and business owners and executives. And I'm saying, but while there might be a little bit of a challenge there, they're not your key bottlenecks. They're not the people holding your projects up. So trying to understand all their capacity and how much of their time is project work and BAU, you're doing a lot of work and a lot of admin and creating a lot of noise for very little value. So start by identifying your golden resources. Once you know who they are, make a list. Name, surname, contact details. In most cases, the resources that are the bottlenecks or the golden resources will probably sit outside of the PMO, may have different line managers, may come from different business units. So line manager role, if you want to do detailed analysis, skills and experience and those type of things, the more information we have about the specific resources, the richer the reporting, the analysis, those things that you can do. For those of you that are PPO clients, it's getting a good, consistent set of resource information. Who's the resource? This resource works in the project office. She sits in the United Kingdom. She reports into Manny. She's a business analyst. She's a contractor. And as I said earlier, if the cost or the revenue side of it is, then you can start to put costs and capacity and those type of things to it. But having a list of those key resources and having some attributes about them, improve on it. If you're going to do this for 20% of your resources, which you believe are the golden resources, start with that. You can always grow it as you go and add more job families or job skills or different line items to it, but don't try and do it for everybody. If you've got 100 resources that are working in projects, it's going to take you 3-4 times as long to do 100 resources than it will to start with your 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 golden resources. So don't get sucked into trying to do this for the entire resource pool too quickly. Step number 3B, which is crucial, is understanding the standard working hours. So because resources are not dedicated to projects, you need to understand which resources are part of your capacity, that are part of your supply, but then go and understand how much time are they available to work on projects. It's very rare that you can say this person works 100% of their time on projects. So I always go through the exercise of saying, for the resources that we've identified, go and understand how much time is project time. Put your BAU allocation aside, put your leave and your admin and your training time aside, and go and work out what those standard hours are, whether it's per day or per week or per month. It doesn't really matter what granularity you do it, but go and work out what that capacity is. Because once you've done that, you've effectively got to a point where you understand what your supply is. You know what capacity you have per role, per skill, per line manager, per department, and you should be able to, at least as a starting point, have a capacity plan that says, okay, our supply is the following. Whether it's an Excel spreadsheet left-hand side or a nice PPO graph or some other tool graph, doesn't matter, but we have an understanding of what our capacity is. Who are the resources that we're trying to manage? What is their job title or their role? How much availability do they have for the next 3 months or 6 months or a year or however far you want to try and do it? And at that point, you understand the capacity. You understand the supply that you have within the organization. Okay, if that was just background noise or a question coming in, I'm going to carry on, and if it's a question, Taryn can address it on the side. So step number 3, very briefly, identify your golden resources. Try and get as much information around the attributes, job title, roles, those type of things, and then go and figure out what their capacity is that you can depend on from a project point of view. You cannot depend on full-time capacity. Step number 4, and this is where, it starts to get tough, is we need to create a visibility of the current status. So First couple of times we did this with organizations was we developed a resource capacity management process and mechanisms and forums and decision making. And we found that it was actually quite difficult to get everybody around the room to understand where we are. So our strong recommendation, having done this a number of times now, is step number 4 is go and do a stock count. Go and get a current view of what's currently going on. I don't think anybody on this call is starting to do projects tomorrow. You probably already all have a portfolio of projects, full, busy, projects may be under threat, projects may be behind. But my recommendation is once you know which resources you want to manage, go and get a current stock count. Ask the project managers of those current projects to give you a view per resource what the allocation in hours or percentage is for the projects for the next 6 months at a minimum. If you've got a project that's running for a year and you've got a good handle on what the resource capacity requirement is and you've got that information available, great, go and get it for a year. But as a starting point, try and get an assessment for at least 6 months what the capacity is. And once again, if that's an Excel spreadsheet or if that's a tool like PPO, doesn't matter. But what we found is getting a visual view of what the current resource allocation is, good or bad, under-allocated or over-allocated, as a starting point, kickstarts a lot of the work that you're going to need to do. Trying to do it when you don't have a view is quite difficult. It becomes a lot theoretical, and a lot of the other areas that you're dependent on to contribute and to play their role don't feel as though this is such a big problem. So we found that if you can create a narrative and show the picture and talk about it with some real practical actual information relating to your scenario, you start to unlock the conversations and start to get the attention of the necessary people. So in our example over here, anybody that's red, I'm talking about the graph on the right-hand side, those are people that are over-allocated. And that's what's going to happen. When you do this exercise, you're going to get massive over-allocation. And then you can see someone like Alan, where there's total under-allocation. So you're going to get this mix. And in most cases, your allocation, I can almost bet my salary on it, your allocation of resources would be way more than what's currently available. So your demand would be much higher than your supply. You're going to show the business that everybody's over-allocated, and all that's going to lead to is potential project overruns in the future. We've planned too much work for the resources that we have, and while it might look good now that the projects are moving, they will be delayed down the line because resources just don't have enough capacity to deal with it. Never mind a crisis or somebody getting ill or a project going south or something like that. So you need to create that narrative. It's a simple exercise. If you don't have a tool, get a spreadsheet, ask the project manager for these key resources that we identified in step number 3. Give me your best view of the allocation of these resources for the next 6 months, hours per month or percentage allocation or whatever mechanism you want to use, and start to get it. You'll get a view per resource of where there's over allocation and who's got pain. And if you flip it, you'll be able to also show the business which projects are currently running and how the resource stacking is happening. So in this example over here, you can see that I'm running a fairly high level of resource utilization. 80% of my resources are currently planned to work on projects. But as my projects start to end, in this case come December, my resource capacity actually has a lot of capacity, because then I'm only planning 10 and all the way down to sort of 5%. And you can see that the biggest project that I'm running in my portfolio today is the cost to income ratio project, which is eating about 30% of my capacity. So creating that narrative, unfortunately, I can also guarantee you that your graph is not going to look like this. It's going to peak at the 110, 120% level, and it might not look as simple as this, where it's literally a month or two. It might go on for 3, 4, 5, 6 months where you're way over allocated. But creating that stock count starts to drive the right conversations. We found that trying to do this without creating the narrative and without actually having a view of this information is quite painful. If you work in an agile environment, it's normally a lot easier to get this, although I have seen a lot of cases where people are adopting agile, and it's not, a true agile environment where we have dedicated teams working on projects. You have one resource, they work in an agile way, but they're involved in 5 projects. So, you still have to do that percentage allocation of, well, they're spending 20% of their time on each one of the 5 projects, or, 50% on this project, or 20% there, or 10% there. But getting that stock count of information, understanding which resources are currently allocated, that's a key step in the process. Once you're there, you have credible information as to what your current capacity looks like. And that's key for step number 5, which is to start your resource management conversations. What you need to do is identify every forum, meeting, committee that you have that deals with projects, project activation, project process, portfolio management, strategic goals, meeting your KPIs, and start having the conversations about the resource capacity. Project review committees, project activation boards. If Exco get a view of the portfolio of projects, if Exco are approving projects because the auditors said we got a vacancy there, or the HR director needs to plug a compliance gap or something like that. If Manco or your middle management are driving your scorecard and they starting initiatives and projects to achieve certain goals in your scorecard, you need to identify all the forums in the business that activate and work and approve and allocate projects. And then you need to start having the conversations around over allocation, under allocation, vacancies that you might have that might be filled. I always tell the clients that I engage with, be transparent and tell them. Currently, because we're looking at golden resources, we're only looking at 40% of our resources. Every month when I come back, I'll try and improve that to 50, 60, 70. But we believe this 40% of our resource pool is where the problem is, and that's what you want to discuss. Any organization that isn't doing project priorities or that is doing project priorities, those are the type of conversations that you need to be having. Having the credible information of how over-allocated your resources are, how stretched you may be as a business, drives these conversations. When I've gone to these type of forums and explained to Exco that we can't start this project yet and we have to wait for Q2, it sounds like a lot of noise and a lot of the PMO not being able to deliver fast enough and not being agile enough and all these type of things. But really, when you have the information to back up why you're saying we have a gap, we have an over allocation in this type of role, or we need to better sequence this, or we need to talk more about prioritizing projects, having that information set available, even if it's in an Excel spreadsheet with some graphs in Excel, that's the good starting point to do it. What you then need to do as a last step is implement a simple process to maintain this information. So the stock count you must see as a once-off initiative that you need to go through to get a current status. You've got projects, they're in flight, they've got plans, they've got deadlines, they've got commitments that have been made. The PMO, the project manager, the sponsor, they've committed these certain things to the business and to the different clients. And you now need to say, okay, well, this stock count that we did, we need to maintain it as best as we can. So you need to have a simple process. Who adds to those golden resources? Who maintains those golden resources? As new resources join, people leave, we extend the list of golden resources and we start to deal with more and more of the resource pool. As projects move around and get delayed and get additional phases, or as new projects get approved into the portfolio, or should it happen that projects get put on hold or get cancelled, you need a process in place that says the project team members allocate the resources, the project managers review and approve it, line managers allocate the resources. So building a simple resource allocation process of who adds projects into the portfolio, who updates the resource allocation, who moves resources around. Is there an approval that happens when a line manager approves the resource, or is that a discussion that happens on the side and then added to the spreadsheet? But you have to, at that point, implement a simple process. And all you're trying to do here is implement a process that the stock count that you did as a once-off can be maintained. You want to maintain it at least on a monthly basis so that you're constantly creating that view and that visibility of what happens. And if you follow those 6 steps, you then have a situation where you've identified why you're doing this, You've identified on a very high level the level of work that you're going to track, project, BAU, operations, whatever it may be, the resources that you're going to focus on as a starting point, creating the stock count or the visibility of where we currently sit today, understanding what the current forums are that are impacting on the delivery of projects, approving projects, activating projects, getting more resources, and creating that simple process that the team can start to do on a monthly basis to keep that information. And if you've done that, you then start to have a very basic capability to deal with resource capacity management. The good news is you've done a lot of work and you can do that fairly simply and quickly that we've seen, but now the real pain starts to happen where the change needs to happen within the business. So in doing this, there's going to be some stuff that happens immediately that's going to challenge you, that's going to get thrown, you know, as a stumbling block. There's going to be some things that start to happen short term. In short term, I'm talking normally about 3 to 6 months that we see that, and then other stuff 6 months plus that we start to see organizations battling with. But all of these are aimed at addressing the inherent problems that are caused by this resource capacity management. So I think just some word of warning of stuff that you're going to see, and just when it does pop up, at least you'll say, okay, well, I remember Guy mentioning this. The first thing is trying to do your resource capacity planning of your projects. What we've learned in the past, having done this for many years, is very few organizations are mature enough to have resource capacity management be able to be done off the project plans. So I've seen organizations try and create, you know, a view of what the resource capacity plan is by asking all project managers to send their project plan to the PMO, or having a tool like PPO where they've got all the project plans in one place and trying to articulate what the resource capacity requirement is of the project plans. The reality is, for numerous reasons, we can spend a whole hour talking about that, most organizations are not mature enough in trying to deliver a resource view of a project plan. You know, the common thing is, well, I don't know what resources I need because I'm still in planning. But what we find is a lot of organizations are planning projects, are doing pre-project work, trying to articulate a business case, trying to understand whether this IT system can be implemented and what the time and cost and effort would be, or if you're a sales organization doing pre-sales work to try and bring a customer on board. And those resources that you need for that work are part of your golden resources. And you get stuck with this problem where you're trying to do these projects, you haven't got a plan yet, but you're using the same resources. So immediately when you try and do this, you're going to get challenged by the fact that most of our projects don't have credible, good project plans. If you work in an agile environment, you don't even have the concept of a Gantt chart or project plans like you would traditionally have. And a lot of time is spent before you get to the end of traditional planning in terms of those resources. So our recommendation is don't try and do it off a project plan. Don't try and use your schedules to do those. Rather go with a model of a simple resource allocation. Project manager, you're doing this business case for the new ERP. Which resources are you going to use for the next 6 months? Give me a gut feel for the estimation of the percentage time and put it on the spreadsheet. By then you start creating that view. When you do have a project plan, if you do have a project plan, if that project plan has a good understanding of the resource, great. You'll update that using the simple process I spoke about in step number 6. But that's one of the first hurdles you're going to get to. Then the stuff that's really going to actually start to add value is you'll start to very quickly start identifying inefficiencies. By having gone through this exercise, we very quickly, most clients turned around and said, our biggest problem is planning. We are ineffective. We think these things take a week. They end up taking 2 weeks. We plan this to happen in a month. It ends up taking 3 months. I've got clients that want to start projects, and just to get the right stakeholders in a room to kick off the project, what they think is going to happen in a week ends up taking a month because people are just too over allocated and they can't activate. So while the expectation is that we can kick off projects and, you know, when you approve it in forum A, within a week we can have a kickoff, The reality is, in this business, it takes us 3 to 4 weeks to have those. So you very quickly start to see some of those inefficiencies, whether it's poor planning, whether it's resources that are over-allocated, but those things will immediately pop up. Almost immediately, I can guarantee you, you will start to discuss project prioritization. Very few organizations we work with have effective, proper project prioritization, and when it is done, in most cases, it's just done theoretically. It doesn't actually drive where you allocate your resources, whether that's time, people, or money. It's just done to say these are the priority of projects, so when we report on it, we do it in this sequence. But actually, if I need this resource, I'll pull them off project number 2 and allocate them to project number 4 because the sponsor is more aggressive or the project manager's been here longer or any one of those things. So in the short term, what we commonly find is that a lot of organizations then really start to properly understand why project prioritization is important and why doing it is important and why allocation of resources and moving of resources and shifting of resources must follow the prioritization. You know, in the past, some people will say, well, you have to have a prioritization model first and then develop it and then prioritize your projects and then allocate your resources. Having done this practically, do your stock count, good or bad, irrespective of the project prioritization. And then when you have that view and you see that over allocation, then you can start to understand. And then business will start to understand why prioritization is important, why it's important that we do this. Even more important than prioritization is sequencing. A lot of organizations don't sequence or do proper portfolio management, don't understand the dependencies of projects in terms of components that are required or resources that are required, or just general sequencing. Get this project done first. Based on that, these resources are available. We can then sequence the next project. It's that horrible thing where projects all seem to start early in the financial year and they all seem to cascade and compete for the resources at the same time. So what you will start to see in 3 to 6 months immediately is, we need to sequence these projects better. We need to prioritize and sequence them so that they get activated in a flow which makes sense for the capacity. One of the horrible things that will happen, depending on where you sit within the business, is the whole headcount discussion. Executives, forcing project officers to do more with less with the resources that they have, you will immediately get sucked into that headcount discussion. We can't do this amount of projects with this headcount. So one of two things has to happen: increase the headcount or decrease the portfolio. So that will immediately start to happen. And maybe that's what you want as a PMO manager. Maybe that's one of the conversations you need. Having gone through the process and creating the narrative, you'll be able to do that. Things that will happen in the medium term is you'll start to improve the cost estimates and the work estimates of your projects. So we found that organizations that do this, they start to get a much better handle on how long these things take. And ultimately, the reason why they do this is service delivery. By doing resource capacity planning, by improving our planning, by improving the narrative of projects and sequencing them right and prioritizing them right, ultimately the customers of the PMO are happier because they understand that things need to happen in a certain way and we don't overcommit and we don't allocate too many projects too quickly and those type of things. So practically, in conclusion, 6 steps. Be clear on what it is you're doing and why you want to achieve it. And really ask yourself the question. Focus on those broad work types. Don't try and do it to an activity level or down to a task level or something like that. It's way too painful to start. Only do it for key resources. Don't try and do it across all resources. Inherently, you could talk to the project managers. They'll tell you, these are the 10 resources that we always battle with. These are the people that we need on all projects. These are the people that are always too busy. You'll know what those resources are. Do that stock count, get that visibility. Take that visibility to your forums and start showing it and start explaining the problem with real data, with real projects. And then put that process in place that you can start to update that information every time a resource moves, gets allocated, or gets disengaged. Our belief is that if you do these 6 steps practically, in a very simple way, you can start to do it. Those things that will happen in the short to medium to longer term, they will start to happen and they will start to drive those conversations around priority, headcount, all those type of things. But those are what we believe and what we've seen to be 6 very clear, simple steps to get going. I feel like I'm going to overrun my time here, Taryn. Okay, questions?
You guys can take yourself off mute if you've got any questions.
Okay, if there are questions, you're more than welcome to shout them out, or I see there are one or two things typed up here. Taryn, I don't know if you've been addressing them.
Yeah, no formal questions, Guy.
Taryn.
Yes.
Mine, it will be just a comment. Thank you so much, Kay, for giving this informative presentation. Indeed, it does cover a lot of things that I was thinking about when it comes to resource management. It is in detail indeed, and thank you so much for this fruitful engagement that we had this afternoon.
Thank you very much for that comment. I don't know if everybody's shocked and there's no questions, or if they're all just consuming it. Yes, question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Guy. Just a question. I just made a note as you were chatting, but I didn't kind of capture enough detail. That was about productivity. You mentioned about measuring productivity of resources. And I was curious, what's our measure of that?
So, I mean, the challenge is a lot of clients that come to us want to understand what their resources are working on, and they start thinking that the planning side of it is important. But if you want to understand how productive your resources were, or were your resources working on the right thing, then the utilization stuff is the important stuff. And then it's that horrible conversation about, do you make them do a timesheet or those type of things? If you work in an agile environment, do you follow a proper, how do you size the work? Do you do it in hours? And, this is a piece of work that needs to be done and it's 4 hours, and then record the time spent on it 6 hours. So the productivity or the utilization is something that you have to ask the question afterwards, how much time did it take? If you do the planning side, we're going to do a requirement specification for this project. We're going to plan to spend 40 hours on it, and you can then afterwards go and see that you spent 60 hours on it. That obviously is a huge discussion that then needs to happen as to, did we underestimate this? Are we ineffective in delivering it, or what the situation is? Because that resource that did that requirement, when they get asked on the next project, how long is this going to take? They should be saying 60 and not 40. And we find a lot of organizations constantly underestimate the planning side. And when the work gets done, it's not an inefficiency. It's just a lack of, maturity within planning, that things just take longer. So doing the planning side and then the utilization side, where are they spending their time, starts to improve your estimation. I mean, I hate timesheets. I left KPMG 25 years ago. I was so glad I was never going to do a timesheet again in my life again. And then I got involved with projects, and I'm still doing a timesheet. But I mean, it's a useful tool to try and understand how much time did we spend. And if you do the planning side, you get a plan versus the actual. I mean, at PPO, for example, every time we do a project, we have the information available and we say, this was the plan time, this was the actual time. And if there's big variations, we ask ourselves why. Inefficiencies, lessons learned, under planning, those type of things. If you're doing projects for clients, then obviously the productivity of those resources is important, because that typically touches on your bottom line. If you sell project work and project delivery and you're selling 200 hours but using 300, I mean, the profitability of those projects in the medium to long term are going to become a problem. So the profitability and the utilization side typically comes in understanding where the time was spent. And, as painful as it is, understanding time spent is a timesheet or some sort of, agile environment where you're recording time spent.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Does that answer your question?
Sure.
We've had clients, I think your name is, can't see your name there, starts with a T, I presume.
Yeah, it's Tuto.
Say again?
Tuto.
I mean, we've had clients that have introduced timesheets for certain resources only for a period of time, just to try and get a better handle on how long certain activities take or how long or where people are spending their time. So even if it's just an initial process where, you know, you're trying to get a better understanding of how long these things actually take, that's one way of doing it. Some organizations don't do a timesheet, but they do record the time spent on certain key activities, and at the end will report, well, this requirements session that I did cost me 40 hours. You know, they're not filling an 8-hour-a-day timesheet, but they are measuring the time spent to better help the utilization and the planning going forward.
Great.
Yeah, you're right there, Guy. We're actually, so this is Trish from a company called Symphony in the UK, originally from South Africa, so it's actually nice to hear all the South African accents in the background. Thank you. So we're actually doing exactly what you've just said. You know, we're pulling in time from a different timesheet system completely, but actually allocated to tasks or milestones as they stand. And because of that, we're actually being able to measure our productivity and our profitability against our projects a lot better. We're only just starting on this journey, but we're already starting to be able to see who our most used resources are and those that aren't quite as used and can actually balance the load a bit.
Yeah, and it's hugely valuable information. I mean, we always ask ourselves the question at PPO, can we forgo timesheets? Can we stop doing timesheets? But the benefit we get out of it is important. We do proper resource capacity planning up front, so we've got a very good handle on who's planned where, who's allocated where, internal projects, BAU operations stuff, and then our customer facing stuff. So we get that great before and after picture. But it takes time. And I mean, Trish, you're on the journey now, but these things take time. But you very quickly in the short term start seeing some things. And that's the important thing. By taking a step forward, going through it and starting it, you start to address it. And I think that's the key thing is, you know, some sort of action, which gets you some sort of understanding, which then gets you some sort of way forward. Okay, if there's no questions quickly, I mean, we do a bunch of these events. Taryn will share the presentation, and I think this deck is there. We do PPO product events. So for those of you that are PPO clients, there's specific events that focus just on the product. But then we do a whole bunch of the industry stuff, which is not PPO specific. We run the PMO forum for those of you that know. So Taryn will share this. If PMOs are your thing, Lindsay Scott, some of you in the UK will recognize her. She's from the House of PMO and has been involved for many years in PMOs. So she's doing a presentation for us in August, early in the morning, around taking ownership of your PMO career. So that's aimed at people in the PMO space. If you're a PPO client, we're doing one on data quality, understanding what data quality is, why it's important, and how you do it. And then if you're more PPM focused, then most of you should know Americo Pinto is the CEO of the PMO Global Alliance. They run the PMO Global Awards, competitions, and those things. He's presenting for us middle of September around what makes a world-class PMO. So all of these events are on our website, and if you're not sure, you can just contact us. Go to ppo.com/all-events. But we try and do one of these at least once a month for the different audiences, for PPO clients, for PMO people, for PPM, you know, people, but just to try and share knowledge, have conversations, and give back some of the lessons that we learned.
Sorry, Kay, before I let you go, I meant to ask you, from the initial invite, I see it stated the resource management capability within 30 days. Now I was thinking around 30 days, there's any specific or any justifications around the 30 days that you mentioned?
So, I mean, what we found in the past is that it's quite a difficult journey to go on. And I think a lot of organizations try and overcomplicate it and they spend way too much time. What I've said to my clients when we've done this is let's try and get to a point that in a month, we have a credible view of which are our key resources, what's our current capacity, what are some of the challenges we have around lack of prioritization or those type of things. But I mean, you could spend 6 months doing resource capacity management. But my feeling is if you can get through those first 6 steps in a month, it's using those sort of time boxing principles to say, let's get a credible view of where we are in the next month. let's put a simple process in place and let's start the conversation. Because the challenges relating to resource capacity management, as I referred to, is not that the resource capacity management, it's things like prioritization of projects. It's things like the activation. It's things like there's just an unnecessary expectation or unachievable expectation of all these projects we're going to do with the resource capacity that we have. We just have too many projects. In clients that don't have a centralized PMO or at least a view of it, you find projects running in every corner of the business, and they all tend to use similar resources, so they all tend to bottleneck. So what I've found and what I've said to clients is, I can sit for months with you here and we can work out a process and we can have workshops and we can have discussions, but we've found that to try and do it in a month period, try and get this done in a month, because all you're doing is you're putting down the simple steps to start the process. And that process then leads to proper project prioritization, improved portfolio management, updated accuracy of, a lot of clients don't have PPM tools, so they don't even have a view of this. At least now you've got a starting point. So everything we do at PPM, and me personally as an individual, I've always tried to be as practical as possible. You can spend months on this thing, but my focus is try and get through this. It's that 80-20 principle. In 30 days, you could get through most of this. And then start that journey. So it's just trying to be practical. Otherwise, you're going to end up spending 6 months on this thing. And unfortunately, you're going to end up aborting it. You're going to say, this is difficult. This is time consuming. This touches on a whole bunch of other things like, the stuff I've mentioned. And it just becomes too complicated. So I'm going to abort. So that was the thinking, is try and do it practically. That's why you also can't focus on all the resources. You've got to start with saying, let's start with the basics, get that 80-20% principle, and then grow it. Then it'll start to become its own thing. You'll have those forums in place. You'll have those discussions on a monthly basis. Hopefully the business prioritizes better. Hopefully when you take on the new portfolio of projects, you sequence it better, those type of things. But you at least want to start by doing something simple and practical without spending months on it. No PMO has, 6 months to go and try and get a resource capacity view. You don't have that time.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
We've got a question from Andre Young.
Yes, I haven't heard from Andre Young in years. Hello, Andre.
Afternoon, Guy Jelley.
How are you?
You're looking really good, mate.
How you doing?
I am blessed abundantly, and like you, a lot less weight on my face and on my body, in ideal shape. My project called Project Sexy has yielded great results.
Are you going to include this in the recording, Taryn? Andre, how can I help you?
We've been throwing tools at organizations for years now. I've thrown PPO at organizations, and it has helped tremendously. We've been throwing the right thinking in terms of maturity models and maturity thinking around resource management. Wanted to see whether or not, over and above throwing the thinking, the tools, how do we shift and adjust the DNA of an organization towards credible resource management? So I push you to see if, over and above everything you've shared, is there an instinct, is there a higher sense that we need to also take consideration of to making resource management credible, capable in organizations? Thank you.
Where I've seen the biggest benefit, Andre, is in creating the narrative. I had a client that had a problem. Everything was happening too slow. Projects weren't happening. People were unhappy. The PMO was incompetent. The project managers were useless. All those normal things. When I interviewed the C-level execs, and I said to them, how many projects in the portfolio? 20, 24, 25. When we did that stock count, step number 4, there were over 90 projects in the business. So that's the first problem, is that the business doesn't have control of the portfolio of projects, and therefore obviously the resources are stretched because there's 90 projects, yet people think there's 20 or 25. And maybe from some people in the business, that's their view of it because that's their focus or that's what they're aware of or whatever. But, so what I've found has been very practical always helps. Get into that stock count. These are my resources. These are my projects. If the conversation is, well, there's just way too many projects. We didn't even expect this many projects to be running. You know, those type of conversations. So I've always found being very practical and getting to some level of data, even if it's got an 80% accuracy, starts the right conversations. Heads turn, people start looking. Then you can do all the maturity type stuff and the formal stuff and all those good things. You know, throwing a high level tool, even a tool like PPO at the problem immediately, you know, those are not the solutions. The solutions is trying to understand what the current status is, and then based on that, having those narratives to say, okay, guys, now that we all see this, what do we do? It doesn't matter how many more project managers we appoint, or, you know, whether you shift the PMO to a different, you know, space in the business or whatever. There's an inherent problem that we've got too many projects and too little resources. You know, those are, and then those conversations. So I've just found in the past, very practical, get the underlying data, create the views, and start the conversations. That's what I found starts to drive people to acknowledge the problem, understand it to a degree, and start to contribute to helping it. And I've been involved with exercises where it's been a pure PPM implementation. Before my PPO days and during my PPM days, that the technology is going to solve the problem. I've been involved with exercises where, hopefully, you know, no disrespect, but you've got a Accenture or one of these big guys on the you know, in the client space, and they've got all this stuff going on. But I've just found being very simple, very practical, getting that view in place, and based on that, moving the narrative. That's where I've seen the value.
Thank you, Guy. I think you hit the nail on the head.
Cool.
Starting the dialogue.
That's the thing. You've got to
with
start
data.
Yeah, you've
with
got to
data.
Start, yeah, and I mean, that's for me where it starts and ends, is get that view, create that visibility, start the conversation. People start to acknowledge, okay, I see what the problem is. This is not just, you know, PMO concerns, or, you know, now we see what the problem is, and then you start the conversation.
If I can add to that.
I know we've overrun a bit.
If I can add to the answer, Dai.
Yeah.
Sense making using the data makes sense. Building and becoming through the dialogue is key. Activating and amplifying quickly is where it happens. And that sense making, building, becoming, amplifying, activating, I call that futuring. Futuring the resource management capability. Getting that cycle. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I look forward to the recording, Tarek. Thank you, guys.
Cheers, Andre. Nice to see you again. Okay, any other questions?